There is a particular kind of sorrow reserved for women who marry into power. It does not crash down all at once. It seeps in slowly, between the frames of photographs, in rooms where doors are always closing, just a little too quietly, in the long silences of a marriage the world believes it has fully understood. On this channel, we have sat with such women before. The duchesses, the heirs, the queens held just inside history's frame and just beyond its mercy. Women who paid a private price for lives lived in full public view. Tonight, we turn to another of them, one whose name once echoed across every continent and is now half forgotten by the very world that once could not look away. Her name was Soraya. For 7 years, she was the Queen of Iran. She was 18 when she married the most powerful man in her country, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the last Shah of Iran, the man they called the King of Kings. It was the middle of the 20th century, in a kingdom suspended between ancient tradition and a restless modern age. The wedding was the kind children dream of and nations remember. There was a gown from Christian Dior, sewn with thousands of tiny diamonds, so heavy she could barely carry it. Snow fell over Tehran that day, and the old ones called it a blessing. And there was, by nearly every account that survives, something rarer than any of it. There was love. This was not a marriage arranged for convenience. The Shah had seen her face, chosen her, and wanted her. That is what makes this story so hard to forget. Because 7 years later, that same man, that emperor, that King of Kings, would stand before his people and let her go. Those who were there say his voice cracked as he spoke. He was not ending the marriage because the love had died. He was ending it for a single, unbearable piece of arithmetic. A throne needs an heir. And Soraya could not give him a son. What do you do with a love that is real, but not enough? That is the question at the heart of tonight's story. And it is not a question that belongs only to queens. Many of you watching will know some version of it. The marriage that failed not from lack of feeling, but under the weight of something neither person could change. Soraya lived it on the largest stage in the world. And the world, looking at her face in the years that followed, gave her a name that would follow her to the very end. They called her the sad-eyed princess. She would spend the rest of her life far from the country that had crowned her, and then uncrowned her. And when at last she set her own story down on paper, she gave it a title of just 3 words. 3 words that tell you almost everything about what the years had left her. We will come to those words in time. We will come to all of it. The palace, the empty cradle, the broadcast that broke a nation's heart, and the long quiet that followed. But every life begins before its sorrow, and hers begins not on a throne, but in a missionary hospital in the old city of Isfahan, in the summer of 1932, with a baby girl born between 2 worlds who would never quite belong to either. Let us begin there. Chapter 1 scene. The girl between 2 worlds, in the summer of 1932, in a missionary hospital in the old city of Isfahan. A girl was born who would belong to 2 countries and be at home in neither. Her father was Shah Esfandiary, a nobleman of the Bakhtiari, one of the great tribal families of Persia, a line of chieftains and horsemen whose name carried weight from the mountains to the court. Her mother was a stranger to all of it. Eva Karl had been born in Moscow to a German family, and she came to Persia carrying the cool order of a European drawing room into a land of heat, dust, and ancient ceremony. The child they named Soraya, after the cluster of stars the Persians called the Pleiades, was from her very first breath a meeting of those 2 worlds, and the seam between them would never quite close. She was raised between Berlin and Isfahan, in German and in Persian, in a Catholic faith inside a Muslim country. As she grew, she was sent away to schools in England and Switzerland, the finishing schools where girls of good family learned languages, manners, and how to enter a room. By the time she was a young woman, she moved through the salons of Europe, with an ease few Persian girls of her generation could have imagined. German was her first language. She knew the streets of Berlin better than the bazaars of her father's homeland. And she knew it. Years later, when she finally sat down to write the story of her own life, she described that strange condition of belonging everywhere and nowhere with a clarity that is almost painful to read. She had been shaped, she wrote, into two divergent poles, the one methodically European, the other savagely Persian. Of the very country whose queen she would one day become, she confessed something startling. I knew next to nothing, she admitted, or of the geography, the legends of my country, nothing of its history. Remember that. A girl who would be crowned the symbol of a nation, and who barely knew it. What everyone noticed first were her eyes. They were a pale, startling green, set in a face the press would later compare again and again to the film star Ava Gardner. She was tall and composed, quietly glamorous in the way of a girl raised among Europeans who had never once had to try. In 1948, she was finishing her education in Switzerland, a student of 16, 17, with no notion at all that her future was at that very moment being decided for her, hundreds of miles away, by people she had never met. For in Tehran, a search was underway. The young Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, only recently divorced from his first wife, the beautiful Egyptian Princess Fawzia, sister of King Farouk, was a king without a queen, and more dangerously, a king without an heir. His mother, the formidable Queen Mother Taj ul-Muluk, had taken the matter firmly into her own hands. She was hunting for a bride for her son, and she found her. The story goes, in a single photograph. A relative of Soraya's, a woman named Soraya Esfandiary-Bakhtiari, had a picture of the green-eyed girl. The Queen Mother saw it. Then the Shah saw it. And the dark-haired student in Switzerland, who knew nothing of any of this, became overnight the most talked about young woman in Iran. When the Shah at last met her, he was, by every surviving account, instantly taken. The courtship was swift. It was the courtship of a king, which is to say, it moved at the speed of royal will. There was a meeting. There was a proposal. And there was, beneath all the protocol and politics, something the cynics had not expected. He genuinely fell for her. The most powerful man in the country had chosen a half-German teenager raised on Berlin streets. And he wanted her, of all the women in the world, to be his queen. They were married on the 12th of February 1951 in the Golestan Palace in Tehran. Snow fell over the city that day, and the old people called it a blessing. It should have been the happiest scene of her young life. It nearly broke her body. The wedding gown had come from Christian Dior in Paris, a creation of breathtaking, almost unimaginable extravagance. 37 yards of silver lame, 20,000 feathers, 6,000 small pieces of diamond sewn by hand into the fabric, until the dress itself seemed woven out of light. It was the kind of gown that exists to be photographed and remembered for 100 years, and it was so heavy that the bride, feverish, unwell, not yet 19, could not carry it. In the hours before the ceremony, a lady in waiting knelt and quietly cut yards of fabric away from the petticoat and the train, trimming the masterpiece down simply so the girl inside it could walk. It is a small thing, but hold it for a moment, because this story will return to it. From the very first day, the splendor was heavier than the woman beneath it. The gown was glorious, and it was crushing her. Chapter 2e, the fairy tale, and the coup. She walked into that palace a queen. Soraya Esfandiary, the girl from Isfahan in Berlin, was now consort to the Shah, the king of kings. There were palaces and jewels, and the riches of Persia laid at her feet. The wedding gifts told you the scale of the world she had entered. A bowl of crystal sent by the President of the United States, a set of candlesticks from the King and Queen of England, a fur coat dispatched, of all people, by Stalin himself. The newspapers of the world ran her photograph to an avidly watching public. It looked like the purest fairy tale of the age, the commoner's daughter who became an empress, the love match on the peacock throne. But fairy tales are written from the outside. She tried in those early days to be what the role required. She took up the family charities. She arranged for great European novels to be translated into Persian, so that the children of Iran might read the books she had loved as a girl. It was a gentle impulse, and a telling one. For even in her giving, she gave the country the only world she truly knew, which was not its own, because not everyone in Iran wanted her. To the religious clerics, this new queen was a problem from the start. She was, in their eyes, a half-European girl who had not been raised in the faith, a foreigner in her own father's land, German in her speech, Catholic in her childhood, a stranger to the very legends and history of the people she was now meant to embody. They murmured that the Shah should never have married her, and Soraya, who had felt the seam between her two worlds all her life, now felt it widen into something closer to a wound. She was the most envied woman in the country, and she was, in a way no jewel could ever fix, profoundly alone inside it. She had married a man who loved her. That much was real, and it would stay real for years. But she had also married a country that did not trust her, and a throne that beneath all its gold was quietly waiting. Waiting for the one thing a queen was finally for, the one thing that all the diamonds in Paris could not buy, and that Soraya, when the time came, would not be able to give. The love in those first years was real. This is the part that the later sorrow tends to erase, and it should not be erased. Behind the palace walls, away from the clerics and the cameras, there was a young husband and a young wife who had, against every expectation, genuinely found each other. He was not in private the distant emperor of the official portraits. With her, he softened. They rode together. They spent long evenings in the small rooms of the palace, in the easy quiet of two people who would rather be with each other than with anyone else in the world. For a little while, the fairy tale the public imagined was, in its private heart, simply true. And yet, even in the warmth of those years, there was a coldness at the edge of every room, because the ground beneath the throne was not solid, and both of them knew it. By the early 1950s, the Shah's crown was in real danger. His prime minister, Mohammad Reza, had risen on a wave of national feeling, moving to seize control of Iran's oil from the foreign companies that had long held it. The struggle between the king and his minister grew into a contest for the soul of the country, and the young Shah more and more found himself a figurehead in his own kingdom, a monarch whose power was slipping through his fingers. She watched what it did to him. In her own account of those days, the confident young emperor she had married grew, in her words, somber and distressed. He stopped playing poker with his friends, one of the few simple pleasures he allowed himself. The lightness went out of him. Soraya, who loved him, could do nothing but stand beside a man slowly being crushed by the weight of a throne that might not hold. Then, in the August heat of 1953, it all came apart at once. As the confrontation reached its breaking point, the Shah fled his own country. He and Soraya left Iran with almost nothing settled and made their way to Rome, not as a king and queen on a state visit, but as a frightened couple in flight. And the indignity of those days stayed with her for the rest of her life. There was no proper residence arranged for them. She would complain bitterly that the Iranian ambassador had failed even to find them a place to stay. They were hounded through the streets by the Roman paparazzi. A deposed monarch and his wife, reduced to harried guests in a foreign hotel. She remembered a particular moment from that exile, a glum, defeated Shah talking quietly about giving it all up, about leaving for America, about starting his life over somewhere far away as an ordinary man with an ordinary wife. And then came the telegram. It arrived in Rome with news that turned the world upright again. Mossadegh had been overthrown. The throne was the Shah's once more. Soraya remembered how the glum Mohammad Reza was mid-sentence, talking about moving to the United States, when he received it. And then he shouted aloud with joy. In the space of a single message, the exiles became again a king and queen. They went home to Tehran in triumph, restored. The danger passed, but something had happened in Rome that would never quite leave him. They had walked through fire together. True fear, true loss, the genuine possibility that they would lose everything. And in one sense, it bonded them as only shared danger can. They had clung to each other in a foreign city when the whole structure of their lives had collapsed. That is not a thing two people forget. Yet the ordeal taught the Shah something else too. Something colder. Something he would never unlearn. He had seen with his own eyes how quickly a throne could vanish. A reign could end in a week. A dynasty could be swept away in a single August. And a king who has felt the ground open beneath him does not afterward sleep easily. He thinks about permanence. He thinks about the future. He thinks about what and who will come after him. A crown that fragile needs roots. It needs continuity. It needs, above all else, an heir. And so, as the danger receded, and the palace settled back into its gold and its routine, a new kind of quiet began to gather in those rooms. Not the quiet of peace, the quiet of a question. No one wanted to ask aloud. The fairy tale was holding. The love was holding. But the years were beginning to pass, one after another. And in all that splendor, in all those palaces, there was one small room that stayed empty, a cradle that no one had filled. And with every season that went by, the silence around it grew a little louder. Chapter 3, The Empty Cradle. A year passed, then another, and the question no one had spoken aloud began slowly to fill every room she entered. In a private marriage, the absence of a child is a private grief. It is born quietly between two people in the dark. But Soraya's marriage was not private. She was the queen of a dynasty whose entire future rested on a single requirement, that she produce a son to inherit the peacock throne. And so her body, her most intimate self, became a matter of state. The thing she could not do became the only thing anyone seemed to see. The pressure did not come gently. It came above all from inside the family. And its sharpest edge was the Queen Mother. Taj-ul-Muluk had chosen Soraya from a photograph. Now, watching the months go by with no announcement, she turned on the girl she had selected. It is said that she had her courtiers watch the young queen, that they kept a close eye on Soraya's waist, on her eating habits, searching for any sign of the news the dynasty was waiting for. And one day, the old woman is said to have come to her daughter-in-law and demanded, with no softness at all, "So, when are you going to give my son a boy?" Imagine being 20 years old and a queen, and hearing that from the woman who was meant to be your mother in this new country. There was nowhere to put such a wound. There was no one in that whole gilded court who was wholly on her side. The Shah's sisters, who had long resented her place beside their brother, joined in the whisper campaign. The gossip spread through the court like a slow stain. The queen was barren. The queen was failing. The queen could not do the one thing a queen was for. And Soraya, raised between Berlin and Isfahan, trained in the drawing rooms of Switzerland, had no native ground to stand on. She was surrounded, and she was alone. So they went looking for answers, the way the wealthy and the powerful do. The royal couple traveled to specialists in Europe and America, submitting to examination after examination, searching for some reason, some remedy, some hope. In New York, doctors told her something that briefly allowed her to breathe. The problem, they said, was not physical. It was the shocks, the upsets, the vexations of the last 2 years. Stress alone, they suggested, might be the cause. She held on to that. Then came Boston, and Boston told her the truth she had been dreading. She was infertile. She would never bear a child. The Shah, who had traveled with her, spent much of the rest of their trip simply trying to console a woman who had taken the news, by every account, very badly. And here the story turns in a way that history rarely pauses to note. Because not everyone accepted that the fault was hers at all. While the court declared the queen barren, while a whole nation was quietly taught to see her as the woman who could not give the Shah a son, some accounts insist that by the doctor's own findings, Soraya had no fertility problem whatsoever. Whether the obstacle truly lay with her, or with the Shah, or with some cruelty of chance that belonged to neither of them, may never be known with certainty. But this much is beyond doubt: it was Soraya, and Soraya alone, who was made to carry the blame. A woman publicly condemned for a failure that may never even have been hers. And the machinery of the dynasty, having found its verdict, began at once to look for a way around her. The solution, when it was finally proposed, was almost unbearable in its coldness. The Shah, pressed by the constitution, by his ministers, by the iron logic of succession, raised the possibility of taking a second wife, not of casting Soraya out. She could remain his queen, remain at his side. But another woman would be brought in to do the one thing she could not, to bear the heir. It was not, in that time and place, an unheard of arrangement. The Shah's own father had kept more than one wife. To the men around him, it must have seemed a reasonable compromise, a way to save both the dynasty and the marriage at once. To Soraya, it was the end of everything. She refused, completely and without hesitation, citing what she called her European principles, the simple, unbending belief that a marriage was sacred and whole. She said, in words she would later set down herself, that she could not accept the idea of sharing her husband's love with another woman. She had been raised in the West, in a faith and a culture that knew no such bargain, and she would not begin now. On this, the half-German girl who had never quite belonged to Iran was absolutely, immovably herself. It was an act of dignity, and it was, though she could not yet see it fully, the closing of the last door. Because once she had refused to share him, only one path remained. If the dynasty must have its heir, and she could not provide it, and she would not stand aside for a second wife, then the marriage itself could not survive. Her own integrity had narrowed the future down to a single terrible outcome. She would keep her dignity, or she would keep her husband. She could not keep both. The court understood this. The Shah understood it. And somewhere in those quiet, agonizing months, a decision began to take shape. A decision that would soon be carried in a single broadcast into every home in Iran. It is said that she understood it fully on a walk through the palace gardens in the summer of 1957. The Shah took her arm, and the two of them moved through the grounds in the warm light. And he began to speak, carefully, gently, about the survival of the dynasty, about the future of the throne, about the heir that had to come. He did not say the words outright. He did not have to. Soraya, walking beside the man she loved, heard underneath his careful sentences the thing he could not quite bring himself to say. that the marriage was ending, that he had run out of ways to keep both his crown and his wife. What followed were months of the slowest kind of grief. The grief of two people who still love each other, watching helplessly as something larger than both of them pulls their hands apart. This was the cruelty of it. There was no villain in that palace garden. The Shah was not casting off a wife he had tired of. He was being crushed, just as she was, beneath the same unbearable arithmetic. A throne needs an heir, and she could not give him one, and she would not let another woman try. He loved her, and he was going to lose her anyway. Both of them knew it now. Neither of them could stop it. What do you do with a love that is real and is not enough? Chapter 40. The broadcast in February of 1958, Soraya left Iran. She left as it happened. On the 7th anniversary of the fairy tale wedding. 7 years, almost to the day, after the snow had fallen over Tehran and the world had called it a blessing. 7 years a queen. There is something almost unbearable in that symmetry. As though the number that had opened her story had come back to close it. She did not flee in scandal. She simply went to Europe, to her parents' home in Germany, and waited, far from the palace, for the thing she knew was coming. It came in March, and it came in the most public way imaginable. The Shah went before his nation, across Iran, in homes and tea houses and village squares. People gathered to hear the voice of their king, and what he had come to tell them was that he was divorcing his queen. Those who heard it say that his voice broke as he spoke, that the most powerful man in the country, the King of Kings, wept as he gave up the woman he loved before an entire people. He did not pretend the love was gone. That was perhaps the most painful thing of all. He ended the marriage not because the feeling had died, but because a throne had demanded it. And from Germany, far from the only home that had ever crowned her, Soraya issued her own statement. It is one of the most quietly devastating documents in the whole history of royal marriages, because in it, a woman who has just been discarded frames her own destruction as a gift to the people who discarded her. Since His Imperial Majesty had deemed a male heir necessary for the future of the state, she declared she would, with her deepest regret, in the interest of the future of the state and of the welfare of the people, sacrifice her own happiness and consent to a separation from her husband. Sacrifice her own happiness. Read it again. She had been given no real choice in any of it. Not in the marriage, not in the verdict, not in the ending. And yet she stood up in the eyes of the world and offered her ruined life as though it were hers to give. It was the last act of a queen. It may also have been the loneliest sentence she ever spoke. Then the erasure began. She lost the title of queen. The Shah allowed her to keep the lesser style of princess, a courtesy extended to the woman he had loved. But across Iran, reportedly, her image began to come down. The photographs, the portraits, the face that had been on every front page, quietly removed, as a nation was gently turned to face its future and its next fertile queen. Her name disappeared from the public record. Her image vanished from the walls. A country moved on, as countries must, and Soraya was left standing just outside the frame of the life she had lived. Within a few short years, the Shah married again. His third wife, Farah, gave him the children Soraya could not, and received a title Soraya had never held, empress in her own right. The fairy tale had found a new protagonist, and the world, looking away from the woman it had once watched so hungrily, assumed her story was finished. She was free, and she had no idea what to do with freedom. She would spend years trying to find out, moving from city to city, from one life to another, carrying the jewels and the title, and the enormous weight of a name the whole world recognized. And none of the things that make a name feel worth carrying. The palaces were gone. The husband was gone. The country was gone. And somewhere in the years of wandering that followed, a woman who had once been the most photographed queen in the world began quietly to disappear into the life she had been left with. But the wandering was not yet over, and the worst loss of all had not yet come. Chapter 5e. The second death. For a while after the divorce, she simply moved, from Germany to Switzerland, from Switzerland to Italy, a princess without a country, carrying a settlement of jewels and money and a name the whole world recognized. There were other men. The actor Maximilian Schell, the German industrial Herr Gubb or von Habsburg, brief attachments, the company of a beautiful woman trying to remember how to live. But nothing held. She was searching for something to fill the enormous space where a kingdom and a husband had been. And in the middle of the 1960s, in Rome, she thought for one bright moment that she had found it. She decided to become an actress. It was an unlikely turn for a former queen, and she approached it almost shyly, appearing under only her first name, simply Soraya. As if to set down, for a while, the heavy titles she had carried and lost, she made a film in 1965 called The Three Faces, and on that set, she met its director, an Italian named Franco Indovina. What happened between them was not a rebound. She would call him, in time, the second love of her life, and she meant it. After all the cold arithmetic of the palace, after the dynasty and the doctors and the broadcast, here at last was something warm and unguarded, and entirely her own choosing. They lived together in Rome. For the first time since the snow had fallen over Tehran, Soraya was, by every account, happy. It was, of course, complicated. Indovina was married to another woman, so even this, her one free and chosen love, came shadowed at the edges, and the past would not let her go. When the Shah, far away on his throne, learned that his former queen was appearing in romantic scenes on film with other men, he is said to have been so enraged that he bought up every copy of the picture he could find and had them destroyed. Think of that. Years after he had let her go before a watching nation, he still could not bear to watch her belong to anyone else. The man who had given her up was still reaching across the world to take from her. But none of that is what ended it. On the 5th of May 1972, an Alitalia airliner came in toward Palermo through the Sicilian night and struck a mountain a few hundred feet below its summit. 115 people were aboard. None survived. It remains, to this day, the worst air disaster in the history of Italy. And among the dead was Franco Indovina. She had lost the first love of her life to a throne. Now she had lost the second to a mountain in the dark. There is a particular cruelty in the shape of it. The throne, at least, had been a thing she could understand. A vast machine of duty and succession that had ground her down for reasons she could name. But this was something else. This was pure random. Indifferent fate, reaching into a single airplane on a single night, and taking from her the one happiness she had built entirely with her own hands. There was no dynasty to blame this time. No clerics, no queen mother, no constitution. Only the dark and a mountain and silence. She did not recover. In the memoir she would write years later, she spoke plainly of the depression that swallowed her after Indovina's death. A darkness she never fully climbed out of. The losses kept coming in those years. The small circle of those who knew her, who could still reach her, grew smaller. The woman the world had once watched on every front page began quietly to disappear. She moved to Paris. She attended the occasional social event. A dinner, a gallery opening, the kind of evening where a famous face is expected to appear and smile. And then, less and less, even those. The apartment in Paris became her world. The city outside it became gradually something she observed rather than inhabited. And then, near the end of that long decade of grief, came the news from far away that the throne she had been sacrificed for had fallen. In 1979, the Shah was driven from Iran by revolution. The dynasty that had needed an heir so badly that it had given her up. The dynasty whose survival had been worth her whole happiness was swept away in a matter of months, as fragile in the end as it had been in that Roman hotel room in 1953. The peacock throne was gone. The King of Kings became what he had once feared most, a sick and homeless man, wandering from country to country, dying in exile. She had not seen him since the day he was overthrown. But when she learned that he was failing, dying of cancer in Cairo, something in her reached back across all those years. By some accounts, she wrote to him, asking to see him one last time, confessing in words, set down on paper, what she had perhaps never stopped feeling, that she still loved him. Whether the letter reached him, whether he answered, we do not know. He died in Cairo in 1980. And the woman he had wept over on the radio 22 years before was not at his side. She had given up everything for his dynasty. And in the end, the dynasty had not lasted. The husband was gone. The second love was gone. The friends were gone. The throne had taken her future. Fate had taken her happiness. History had taken even the kingdom that had once made all the sacrifice seem to mean something. There was almost nothing left to take. Only the years themselves. The long, quiet years that still stretched ahead of her. And so she went at last to live in the only place left to a woman who had lost everything twice. She went home. To a palace she would build herself out of memory and silence. And she would give it a name that told the whole truth of her life in just 3 words. She called it the Palace of Solitude. Epilogue. The Palace of Solitude, that was the title she gave the memoir she wrote near the end. Palais de Solitude. The Palace of Loneliness. 3 words. After all the real palaces she had lived in and lost. Golistan. The great houses of Tehran, the villas of Rome. The only one that was ever truly, permanently hers was the one she built out of memory and silence, and named for exactly what it was. She spent her last decades in Paris, in an apartment in the city, venturing out less and less as the years went on. And by one of those strange turns that history seems to arrange on purpose, the Shah's third wife, Farah. The empress who had given him the children Soraya could not, who had worn the title Soraya never held, also lived in those same years in Paris. 2 queens of the same vanished throne, growing old in the same city. They never spoke, not once. And then, in the autumn of 2001, in that quiet Paris apartment, Soraya died. She was 69. She died alone, of causes that were never made clear, in a city that was not her home, far from the country that had crowned her, and far from the country that had raised her. There was no state mourning. No nation gathered to hear the news. The sad-eyed princess simply slipped, without a sound, out of the world. Her brother, Bijan, came to Paris for the funeral. He was the last of them, the only one left who had known her since Isfahan. The only person, perhaps, she still truly talked to. When he learned that she was gone, he said just one thing. After her, he said, "I don't have anyone to talk to." Within a week, he was dead too. His heart simply gave out in the same city, as though he could not bear to remain in a world that no longer had his sister in it. They buried her in Munich, beside their parents. In time, her brother would come to lie there too. A few months later, her belongings were carried into an auction room in Paris and sold, and among them was the wedding dress, the Christian Dior gown. 37 yards of silver lame, 20,000 feathers, 6,000 small pieces of diamond. The very dress that, 50 years before, had been so heavy that a lady in waiting had to kneel and cut it away. just so a feverish girl of 18 could walk to her own wedding. It sold that day in Paris for 1.2 million. The splendor had outlasted the woman. The diamonds caught the light in a room full of strangers, exactly as they had on a snowy morning in Tehran half a century before. Except that now, there was no bride inside them at all, and there was one last irony, almost too neat to bear. Soraya left no children. That, after all, had been the whole of it. The empty cradle that had cost her a husband, a crown, a country. And because there was no heir to inherit her, the remainder of her estate passed, in the end, to the German state. The absence that had defined her whole life defined its closing, too. There was no one of her own to leave it to. The world remembered her, when it remembered her at all, by the name it had given her. The sad-eyed princess, it kept the sorrow and let go of the woman. It remembered a beautiful face in mourning, and not the girl from Isfahan, who knew next to nothing of her own country, nor the queen who offered up her happiness, as though it were hers to give, nor the woman who found love a second time on a film set in Rome, and lost it to a mountain in the dark. She had told the truth about herself in the end, in only 3 words: a palace, and solitude, and the long, quiet life she lived inside it, alone, in a city that was not her home, in the last rooms of a fairy tale that had promised her everything, and left her at the close.